So as investors and just human beings, there will likely come a time when we need to borrow some money in order to finance a large purchase. Maybe we're buying a house or a car. Maybe we need to make some kind of investment, start a business. There's a number of different things that we might need to borrow some money for. And so there's a number of different ways you can go about borrowing money, from credit cards to lines of credit, etc. And one of the lesser known ways to borrow money that is growing in popularity as we speak is what is known as M1 Borrow. So M1 Borrow is a part of the M1 Finance app. It's a very popular investing app these days. And M1 Borrow is essentially a function of the app that allows you to borrow money at fairly low interest rates. So in this video, we're going to be going over exactly how M1 Borrow works, how you can use it, and how they can afford to offer you such low interest rates. And quick note, if at any point you want to sign up for M1 Finance, we've got a link down in the description below that'll get you a free $30 when you do so. So if you want to support the channel, feel free to use that link. Now let's dive right on in and talk about what M1 Borrow actually is. Well, like I mentioned, it's a product of M1 Finance, and M1 Finance is an SEC licensed broker dealer that specializes in allowing you to build a long-term investment portfolio. Now, in addition to their M1 Investors, that long-term investment portfolio, they also offer M1 Borrow. Now, M1 Borrow is designed to provide you with something called a portfolio line of credit. And essentially how this works is you are borrowing money against your investment portfolio. So, for example, let's say you have $100,000 in your investment portfolio and you want to make a down payment on a house for $10,000. Well, you clearly have enough assets to make this down payment. You've got $100,000 worth of stocks, but maybe you don't want to sell $10,000 worth of your stocks in order to make this down payment. Well, what M1 Borrow would allow you to do is borrow against those stocks because they know those stocks are there, so they can offer you a very low interest rate because the loan is very secure for them. You borrow against those stocks, they give you 10 grand, you make the payment on the house, and then you owe a little bit of money to M1 Finance that is secured by your portfolio. And so since it's secured by your portfolio, the interest rate is going to be significantly lower. We're talking starting off at 3.5%, dropping all the way down to 2% on the low end. Now compare that to something like a credit card that's got an average interest rate of about 20%, and you're looking at a pretty affordable way to access money. So now you got the gist, let's dive into the features that M1 Borrow has to offer, and we'll get a little bit more nitty gritty. So first off, you can access M1 Borrow directly from the M1 Finance app on your phone by tapping on the borrow icon on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. As you can see here, I have $5,000 borrowed from M1 Borrow right now, and that is because they had a promotion going on earlier this year where you could borrow $5,000 interest-free. So they do these promotions from time to time where you can potentially borrow at a 0% interest rate, which is pretty attractive. Now below that, you can see I've got a 2% base rate. And what that means is I'm paying 2% interest on these funds once that 0% promotional period is over. That's because I am a member of what is called M1 Plus. M1 Plus is a $125 per year subscription that you can choose to subscribe to. It gives you a whole host of additional features on M1 Finance, including lower M1 Borrow rates. Additionally, you can see I have another $700 worth of credit available, which means that I could borrow up to $700 more from M1 Finance if I wanted to. Now, how to determine that is based on the amount of assets you have in your M1 Finance account. So you can see I've got about $16,429 in my M1 Finance account. They allow you to borrow up to 35% of that amount in your M1 Borrow account. So you do the math there, about 30% of that amount is about $5,700, which is my cap for what I'm allowed to borrow. Now, the borrowing process itself is actually very easy within M1 Borrow. All you do is to press the borrow button, you press how much you want to borrow. Let's say we want to borrow $100. We'll press continue. You'll see we want to borrow from our individual account. You'll select what account you want that to go into. So I'll just say my checking account. We'll press continue. And if I press transfer here, I'm going to get $100 transferred directly into my bank account within a couple of minutes. And that loan will have been issued immediately. No paperwork required, nothing required. It's all done very, very quickly, which is super nice and very convenient if you need quick access to funds. Now, if you do want to access M1 Borrow, you do have to have a certain threshold of assets in your M1 Finance account, okay? Because they need to secure your loan against your investments. And so if your investments aren't large enough, they're not gonna be able to issue you a loan. So the minimum is $5,000 worth of investments in your M1 Finance account in order to access M1 Borrow. So if you don't have that $5,000 threshold, you're not gonna be able to access M1 Borrow. Now, another benefit of M1 Borrow is that you can actually potentially deduct the interest expense that you're paying on your taxes. Now, you're gonna have to talk to a tax professional about this, but your investment interest expense is potentially a deductible expense up to the amount of capital gains that you have for the year. So say you have $5,000 worth of capital gains, you pay $1,000 in interest on your investments. That could potentially, again, talk to a tax advisor here, be deductible on your taxes. Now, that being said, there are some risks you're going to want to keep in mind when you are taking advantage of M1 Borrow. The first of which is that you always have the potential of your investments going south. And if that does happen, M1 Finance can issue you a margin call. Okay, and what that basically means is they're saying you got to either pay back your loan now or deposit more money into your investment account because you are overextended. So diving into my phone, I'll show you exactly what that looks like. You can see that in my M1 Borrow dashboard here, under credit status, there's a 57% number. That basically means that if my portfolio value were to drop by 57%, then they would issue me a margin call and say, hey, you've got to either add more money or pay this loan off right now because it's getting too risky for us. So if that number starts to get pretty low, then you're going to want to be a little bit concerned, maybe pay a little bit of your loan back, invest a little bit more money, etc. But you want to keep an eye on that number, make sure it does not get too low. Another risk of M1 Borrow is that the interest rates are always subject to change. So they've been sitting at 3.5% and 2% respectively for quite some time now, but M1 Finance always does retain the right to change those. So as the Fed adjusts interest rates, those could also adjust within M1 Borrow. So speaking of interest rates, how does M1 Finance actually charge you for the money that you borrow? Well, at the end of each month, M1 Finance is going to calculate how much you owe them in interest, and they're going to subtract that directly from your cash balance within your M1 Finance account. Now, if you don't want to do that, you could also create a payback schedule within M1 Finance that's going to dictate when you're going to pay them back and how much, if you want to kind of put that payment plan together. Now, let's talk briefly about the pros and cons of M1 Finance. One of the biggest pros is that the interest rates are so low. So a 2% interest rate for M1 Plus members is very nice, and so is a 3.5% interest rate for everybody else. The simplicity and speed at which you can take out a loan with M1 Borrow is also a very, very big perk for people that might need money short notice. And because M1 Finance is SEC regulated, it's a very safe and secure platform, so you don't have to worry too much about that. There's also no prepayment penalty of any kind, so you can pay off your loan whenever you want without having to worry about anything like that. Now, when it comes to the cons, the biggest of which is that there is a $5,000 minimum investment requirement in order to access M1 Borrow. So if you don't have $5,000 worth of assets in your M1 Finance account, you're not going to be able to access this service. The interest rates are also subject to change, so just because they're low now doesn't mean they're going to be this low forever. So just keep that in mind if you do decide to use M1 Borrow. Now, if you do decide that you want to sign up for M1 Finance, again, we have a link in the description and pinned comment below that will allow you to do that and support the channel. And if you want a more comprehensive, in-depth look at M1 Borrow, we have a full review on our website, investingsimple.com. The easiest way to find that is to head on over to Google, search for M1 Borrow review, and then click on the link for investingsimple.com. We'll see you over there.